The EU Commission will present a bill on hedge funds and real estate funds next week. One draft shows that British providers in particular will suffer. So, the EU Commission wants to tighten the regulations for hedge funds, real estate and investment funds. These investment products belong to the so-called alternative investment funds, and next week the Brussels authority will present an amendment to the EU directive that regulates the management of such funds. The German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung has a draft of this, and among other things, the requirements for delegating fund management to non-European countries are stricter. This is a reaction to Brexit and is primarily directed against the powerful financial centre of London. This delegation is widespread in the industry. In the case of funds that are based in the EU, for example in Luxembourg or Dublin, the investment decisions are then made by managers in London. The EU Stock Exchange Supervisory Authority ESMA in Paris already suggested last year that this delegation to London after Brexit should be more restricted. After all, the financial centre there is no longer subject to European control. The Commission is taking up this demand in the EU legislative proposal, which must now be dealt with by the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers, the decision-making body of the Member States. The amendment is part of a package of legal acts on financial market regulation. Among other things, the directive will stipulate, according to the draft, that funds must have at least two sufficiently experienced managers living in the EU, even if the investment decisions have been delegated to non-EU countries. Approval has already come from the European Parliament. The tightening points in the right direction, says the EPP MEP Markus Ferber, the economic policy spokesman for the Christian Democrat EPP group. Foreign hedge funds are not allowed to bypass European rules by setting up a letterbox company in the EU and then outsourcing key management functions to third countries. After Brexit, this has become a real danger also for consumer protection, he says. The background to the regulatory battle between the EU and the UK is there was a debate about whether the regulatory differences between the financial sectors of the European Union and the UK after Brexit were, so to speak, resolved. As the UK and the EU made no progress in aligning financial sector regulation between June 2016, the date of the Brexit referendum, and the end of the Brexit transition period, which ended on December 31st in 2020, a joint statement was about the willingness to cooperate in regulatory aspects, the only thing that could be found in the 1276-page Trade and Cooperation Agreement that was adopted around Christmas 2020. The EU's refusal to grant equivalence to Great Britain is an indicator of the incompatibility of positions and thus the regulatory battle. In the area of financial analysis, the EU has been content to exclude analyses of companies with a market capitalization of less than 1 billion euros in the previous 36 months from the so-called MiFID rules for analysis and incentives. The FCA has decided to set this cap at £200 million, but with no analysis and incentive requirement for analysis of fixed income securities, currencies and commodities. It also plans to abolish the RTS 27 reporting requirement once and for all. While these changes introduced by the FCA are clearly within the limits of what can be termed natural politic discourse between legal systems, other proposals are far more radical. Last year, after intensive lobbying by the industry against the upper limit for dark trading, ESMA proposed removing the upper limit of 4%, only to lower it from 8% to 7% for the total volume. In contrast, the British government is now proposing in the regulatory battle to completely abolish any automated mechanism that could contain the volume of trading in dark pools. Market participants now feel two divergent currents in financial market regulation competing for the best combination of consumer protection, market stability and integrity, and fair and lively competition. This could lead to a race to the bottom in the regulatory standards, as both legal systems also compete with each other for the attraction of big finance and for the most fertile ground for innovations and young companies to develop future technologies, for example, in payment transactions, in trading or post-trading services, or in other areas. In particular, the proposed dark pool regulation suggests in the regulatory battle that London might be tempted to regain some of the trade it lost to the continent as a result of leaving the European Union, but we will see. It is conceivable that the UK will introduce a regulatory system that is not as strict in reacting to short-term changes and is less restrictive towards smaller companies whose activities are less incisive or which require certain exemptions in their startup phase. The EU is trying to make a similar approach as regulatory proposals, for example, their DLT pilot controls show. This phenomenon in which the actors in politics, in law, in business work towards creating the most demanding environment possible for companies is known as competitive governance. After the financial market crisis, it was right to examine the legal framework for the securities business for weaknesses and, where necessary, to improve them. The European Financial Market Directive has been comprehensively revised in recent years under the heading MiFID and MiFIRE, as I would say, and the regulation on basis information sheets. The new requirements and design guidelines that have to be observed since the beginning of 2018 are spread over more than 20,000 pages. As correct as individual measures are, the interaction of these many individual elements must now be analyzed. Initial experiences already indicate various weaknesses that could be addressed in a revision in the coming legislative period. But what are the weak points at the moment? The willingness of consumers to get involved in the capital markets, especially here in Germany as well, continues to be too low. Apparently, the increasing regulatory complexity is reinforcing the skepticism among investors instead of reducing it. In addition, the investor model seems to be moving more and more in the direction of overburdened consumers. Many investors, especially experienced private consumers and professional customers, feel increasingly overprotected as a result. They are bothered by the longer processes and the further increase in the amount of information. Customers want their banks to be able to do without. Banks miss meaningful differentiation options between different types of customers. But still, it is important to have regulations, to have, here for the case of the EU, to have, of course, the same regulations in all the member states. Because if you have two different systems, the single market doesn't work anymore. And of course, this is the same with the hedge funds and everything else. The single market has to be protected. And yeah, some people will come up with protectionism, blah, blah, blah again. Yeah, that's the whole point of the EU. To have a single market that is protected from unfair or excessive outside influences. And so, of course, this also goes for the capital markets. And I'm quite looking forward to the draft proposal next week and, of course, the end product of the deliberations between the EU member states and in Parliament. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.